long before fields were cultivated, before seeds were deliberately planted into soil, and long before the idea of agriculture existed. Earth carried its own wild and untamed gardens. These were not gardens shaped by human hands, nor were they places of abundance meant for harvest. They were vast, ancient ecosystems where plants evolved, competed, and disappeared long before any human could witness them. Among these forgotten landscapes existed what could be described as a lost garden, a world filled with vegetation that would never become crops, never be domesticated, and never be tasted. To imagine this world is to step back tens of millions of years, into a time when plant life was already diverse but followed entirely different evolutionary paths. The continents themselves were arranged differently, climates were often warmer and more humid, and ecosystems were shaped by forces that no longer operate in the same way today. In these environments, plants were not evolving to be useful, they were evolving simply to survive. Some of these ancient plants produced structures that resemble what might now be recognized as edible parts, fleshy coverings around seeds, nutrient-rich tissues, or energy-dense storage organs. But these were not fruits and vegetables in the modern sense. They were evolutionary experiments, shaped not for human consumption but for survival and reproduction. In ecosystems filled with insects, early mammals, and other organisms that interacted with them in ways still being studied, scientists believe that during the age of early flowering plants, particularly in the Cretaceous period, a wide variety of plant forms emerged that no longer exist today. These plants developed reproductive structures that could attract animals, but the relationships were often highly specialized. A particular plant might rely on a specific insect for pollination or a certain type of animal for seed dispersal. If that animal disappeared, the plant's chances of survival could collapse. There is evidence suggesting that some early, fruit-like structures were quite different from those seen today. They may have been tougher, less sweet, and more chemically complex. Their textures could have ranged from fibrous and dry to thick and leathery. In some cases, these structures may have contained compounds that discouraged consumption by most organisms, allowing only a narrow group of species to interact with them. As ecosystems became more complex, so did the plants within them. Dense forests formed, with layers of vegetation competing for light and resources. In these environments, plants developed increasingly diverse strategies. Some grew taller, others spread across the ground, and some invested heavily in reproduction, producing numerous seeds or protective coverings. Among these strategies were the earliest forms of structures that might resemble modern crops, but they were not yet part of any agricultural system. Over millions of years, many of these plant lineages began to disappear. Some were outcompeted by more efficient species. Others could not adapt to changing climates as temperatures fluctuated and atmospheric conditions shifted. Geological events, such as the movement of continents and the formation of mountains, altered habitats and created new environmental pressures. One of the most significant disruptions occurred at the end of the Cretaceous period, around 66 million years ago. This mass extinction event reshaped life on Earth. While it is often associated with the disappearance of dinosaurs, it also had profound effects on plant life. Forests were destroyed, sunlight was reduced for extended periods, and many plant species that depended on stable conditions could not survive. In the aftermath, the Nebertata that remained began to diversify once again. Flowering plants, in particular, expanded rapidly, adapting to new conditions and forming the basis of many modern ecosystems. However, the plants that had existed before, those early experiments in structure, form, and survival, were gone. What makes this lost garden so compelling is not just that it disappeared, but that it represents an alternate path, an evolutionary direction that did not lead to modern agriculture. The crops known today, from grains to fruits and vegetables, come from a relatively small subset of plant lineages that happened to survive and later proved useful to humans. There were countless others that did not. Plants that may have produced edible structures never encountered humans. Others may have had flavors, textures, or nutritional properties unlike anything known today. But because they vanished long before agriculture began, their potential was never realized. Fossil evidence provides glimpses into this lost world. Impressions of leaves, preserved seeds, and occasionally fossilized reproductive structures reveal shapes and patterns that do not match any modern plant. In some cases, scientists can infer how these plants might have functioned, how they reproduced, how they interacted with their environment, but much remains unknown. Researchers studying these fossils often compare them to modern plants to understand possible relationships. This process, while informative, has limits. Many extinct plants belong to groups that have no direct modern descendants, making it difficult to reconstruct their full biology. Their growth patterns, chemical composition, and ecological roles remain partially hidden. There is also the question of why certain plants survived while others did not. Evolution is not guided by usefulness in the human sense. It is shaped by immediate survival and reproductive success. A plant that thrives in one set of conditions may struggle when those conditions change, even slightly. Over time, these shifts determine which species persist and which are lost. The plants that eventually became crops were not inherently superior in every way. They were simply part of lineages that endured long enough to intersect with human history. Once humans began selecting and cultivating plants, these species were further shaped by artificial selection, transforming them into the foods that now dominate agriculture. But the lost garden existed before all of this. It was a world where plants evolved freely, without human influence, exploring a vast range of forms and strategies. Some of these strategies were successful for millions of years. Others were short-lived, disappearing almost as quickly as they appeared in the fossil record. In imagining this ancient garden, it is important to recognize its complexity. It was not a single place, but a series of ecosystems spread across a changing planet. From humid tropical forests to seasonal landscapes, from coastal regions to inland plains, these plants adapted to a wide range of environments. Each environment produced its own set of plant forms, many of which have no modern equivalent. The leaves might have been shaped differently, the reproductive structures unfamiliar, the growth patterns unusual. These differences reflect the experimental nature of evolution, especially during periods of rapid change. There is a sense of incompleteness in this story. Without living examples, much of what these plants will remain speculative. Scientists rely on fragments, patterns, and comparisons to reconstruct a world that cannot be fully observed. Yet even these fragments reveal a history of immense diversity and creativity in plant evolution. The idea of a lost garden is not just about disappearance. It is about possibility, forms of life that once existed but no longer do. It challenges the assumption that the present represents the peak of diversity or complexity. In many ways, the past was just as rich, if not more so, in certain aspects. Modern agriculture depends on a narrow selection of plants. Despite the thousands of species that exist, only a small number are cultivated on a large scale. This makes the story of extinct plants even more significant. It suggests that the potential range of edible or useful plants was once far greater than what exists today. However, that potential is now locked in the past. The plants of the lost garden cannot be recovered in their original form. Their ecosystems, their interactions, and their evolutionary contexts are gone. Even if fragments of their genetics could somehow be understood, the conditions that shape them cannot be recreated. What remains is their influence. The plants that survive today carry traces of that ancient experimentation. The structures seen in modern fruits, seeds, and vegetables are the result of countless evolutionary steps, many of which involved forms that no longer exist. In the end, the lost garden is a reminder of how much has been left behind. It speaks to the transient nature of life on Earth, where entire worlds can emerge and disappear without leaving more than a faint imprint in stone. It also highlights the deep history behind even the most familiar plants. Every cultivated field, every orchard, and every vegetable garden is connected to that distant past, not directly, but through a long chain of survival and adaptation. The plants that are known today are not just products of recent history. They are the survivors of an ancient and ongoing process. And somewhere deep in that history lies a garden that was never seen, never harvested, and never known, except through the quiet traces it left behind.